Imagine a freezing wind whipping across the desolate, snow-dusted fields of the Ardennes, late in the winter of 1944. Mud, frozen solid then thawing into an impassable quagmire, clung to every boot, making each step a Herculean effort. For the young grenadiers of the Wehrmacht, caught in the brutal aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, every day was a struggle for survival against the elements as much as against the advancing Allied lines. Their rations were meager, their uniforms threadbare, and the constant, gnawing hunger was a familiar companion. They were the hardened core of an army pushed to its breaking point, steeped in a doctrine that preached self-sacrifice and an iron will against a decadent, materialistic foe. But what if the true battle wasn't fought with bullets and bayonets, but with something far softer, far sweeter, a symbol of abundance so alien it shattered their entire worldview? What if a simple baked good became a weapon more potent than any panzer, capable of dismantling an ideology from the inside out? The scene was grim, etched into the memories of those who endured it. Exhausted, shivering German soldiers, many barely out of their teens. Finally, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Allied firepower, laid down their arms. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken from sleepless nights and chronic malnutrition. Surrender, for many, was a physical release from the constant dread and the crushing fatigue. But it was also a psychological rupture, a moment where the grand narratives they'd been fed about the superiority of the Reich and the weakness of the Western democracies were suddenly put to the ultimate stark test. As they shuffled through the processing lines of an American prisoner of war camp, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, a new scent began to cut through the oppressive cold, something warm, sweet, and utterly baffling. For years, the propaganda machine of the Third Reich had painted a picture of an America soft and undisciplined, a nation incapable of sustained, brutal warfare. German soldiers, they were told, possessed an inherent fortitude, a martial spirit forged in hardship that would inevitably triumph over the flabby, consumerist West. Yet here, in the immediate aftermath of their capture, everything they thought they knew began to unravel. The American GIs, often chewing gum with an almost casual confidence, seemed to possess an endless supply of everything. The prisoners watched, bewildered, as crates of sea rations, cigarettes, and even fresh fruit appeared as if from thin air. This wasn't the starving, struggling enemy they'd been promised. This was something entirely different, a logistical marvel that defied their understanding of war itself. Then came the moment that for many crystallized this profound disconnect. An American quartermaster, perhaps with a wry smile, offered them something entirely alien. It was a small, round, fried piece of dough covered in sugar or glaze. They had no frame of reference for it. Some poked it cautiously. Others sniffed it with suspicion. Their own diet had consisted of potato gruel, ersatz coffee, and dry bread, often barely enough to sustain life. The sheer decadence, the apparent frivolity of this item was almost offensive, yet undeniably alluring. It was a donut, a symbol of American plenty, brought directly to the front lines, and now even to its prisoners. This wasn't merely food. It was a revelation, a tangible piece of a world they couldn't comprehend. This seemingly insignificant detail, this sweet, fried dough, began to chip away at the carefully constructed edifice of Nazi ideology. How could a nation so soft, so decadent, as to bake and distribute such items even to its enemies, possess the strength to defeat the disciplined Wehrmacht? This contradiction forced a profound reevaluation among the captured, sowing seeds of doubt about the entire narrative they had been fed. It hinted at a deeper, more pervasive strength in the Allied war effort, one rooted not just in tanks and planes, but in an economic engine that could literally feed its army, and its prisoners better than the Germans could feed their own fighting men. In the next 40 minutes, we'll dive deep into how this seemingly minor detail reshaped perceptions and why it still profoundly influences our understanding of war today. This wasn't some isolated anomaly, but a stark manifestation of two fundamentally opposed war economies. While the German war machine, under the iron fist of Albert Speer from 1942, famously achieved incredible production feats, it was built on a foundation of conquest, plunder, and a fragile supply chain stretched thin across a continent. From the wheat fields of Ukraine to the oil wells of Romania, their strategy depended on seizing resources, not generating them sustainably. Their logistical lines, already strained by the vast distances of the Eastern Front, buckled under the relentless pressure of a multi-front war, leaving their own troops often hungry, undersupplied, and relying on captured equipment. This reality stood in stark contrast to the propaganda of a self-sufficient, invincible Reich. Across the Atlantic, the United States was unleashing an industrial leviathan unlike anything the world had ever seen. The American war effort wasn't about seizing existing resources. It was about manufacturing them on an unprecedented scale. Factories that once built cars now churned out tanks, planes, and Liberty ships at a pace that astounded both allies and enemies. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a new vessel roughly every 16 hours, a staggering testament to their capacity. This wasn't just about firepower. It was about the sheer ability to sustain a global conflict, to feed, equip, and supply millions of men thousands of miles from home. The Quartermaster Corps, often overlooked in the annals of combat, became a logistical marvel, orchestrating the movement of mountains of supplies with meticulous precision. This industrial might translated directly into the daily lives of the American GIs. They ate better, were better clothed, and had access to a wider variety of amenities than any fighting force in history. The donut, that seemingly frivolous item, was a direct product of this abundance. It wasn't just a pastry, it was a carefully engineered morale booster, delivered to the front lines by organizations like the Red Cross and the USO. Mobile donut units, staffed by dedicated donut dollies, would set up shop mere miles from the fighting, frying thousands of fresh donuts daily. The warm, sweet smell of frying dough became a powerful, sensory reminder of home and the immense resources backing every American soldier. For the German prisoners, this wasn't merely a difference in diet. It was an existential shock. Their own rations had been progressively cut throughout the war, leading to widespread malnutrition even among active combat troops. The average German soldier's caloric intake had plummeted from over 3,600 calories a day in 1939 to barely 2,000 by 1944, often supplemented by whatever they could forage or requisition. The concept of an enemy so well provisioned, so seemingly wasteful with its resources that it could offer fried dough to its captured foes, was unfathomable. It directly challenged the core tenets of their nationalist ideology, which had demonized the Western democracies as weak and decadent. If you were in charge of German logistics in 1944, knowing what the Allies could produce, what would have been your strategic priority? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This logistical chasm, starkly illustrated by a simple donut, underscored the unsustainable nature of the German war economy and its inevitable collapse. It revealed that the war was not just being fought on battlefields, but in factories, in supply depots, and even in the kitchens that provisioned the armies. The donut became a silent yet potent psychological weapon, chipping away at the carefully constructed edifice of Nazi ideology. It forced a profound reevaluation among the captured, sowing seeds of doubt about the entire narrative they had been fed. This small, sweet symbol of plenty juxtaposed against the backdrop of German starvation, offered a unique lens into the profound disparities that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. But the story of its impact goes deeper, reaching beyond individual perceptions to reshape the very doctrine of war itself. This small, sweet symbol of plenty, juxtaposed against the backdrop of German starvation, offered a unique lens into the profound disparities that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. But the story of its impact goes deeper, reaching beyond individual perceptions to reshape the very doctrine of war itself. The casual distribution of donuts wasn't an accident. It was a visible manifestation of a strategic reality that fundamentally altered the calculus of conflict. For decades, military strategists had focused on battles won by superior tactics or overwhelming firepower. Yet, World War II, particularly on the Western Front, revealed that the true sinews of war extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a war of factories, of shipping lanes, of supply depots, and of the sheer human will to sustain an effort on a scale never before imagined. The United States, having entered the war later, had the advantage of mobilizing its vast industrial capacity without the immediate threat of invasion. From 1941 to 1945, American factories produced an astonishing 86,000 tanks, 296,000 aircraft, and 64,500 landing craft, alongside billions of rounds of ammunition and millions of tons of food. This wasn't just production. It was a relentless, strategic outpouring that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could sustain. German intelligence, even before the war, consistently underestimated this American potential. They viewed the U.S. as a consumer society, culturally soft and militarily unprepared. This misjudgment became a fatal flaw. While Albert Speer's efforts in Germany did achieve remarkable production boosts, particularly in fighter aircraft in 1944, his system was inherently limited. It relied on a fragmented, conquered European industrial base, often using forced labor, and was constantly under threat from Allied strategic bombing campaigns. The Germans simply could not match the systemic, integrated output of the American economy, which was churning out goods not just for its own forces, but for its allies through Lend-Lease, providing vital supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. The donut, then, became a potent, albeit unintentional, tool of psychological warfare. It wasn't an order from a general, but a cultural expression of abundance, demonstrating a level of logistical sophistication and economic stability that was utterly alien to the German experience. When American POW interrogators debriefed captured German soldiers in camps across England and the United States, reports frequently highlighted the profound shock and demoralization caused by the sheer material wealth of their captors. These weren't isolated anecdotes. They were consistent themes emerging from intelligence summaries, painting a picture of an enemy whose material superiority was so vast it bordered on the surreal. The prisoners spoke not just of the food, but of the fresh uniforms, the medical care, and the seemingly endless supply of everyday items. This stark contrast forced a fundamental reevaluation of the enemy in the minds of the captured. The propaganda that had painted the Allies as weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse crumbled under the weight of a warm, sweet pastry. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about the erosion of an entire ideological framework. If the materialistic West was so weak, how could it sustain such an effort, even providing comforts to its enemies? This question, triggered by a simple donut, began to sow seeds of doubt that spread far beyond the individual prisoner. It hinted at a deeper, more pervasive strength in the Allied war effort, one rooted not just in tanks and planes, but in an economic engine that could literally feed its army and its prisoners better than the Germans could feed their own fighting men. This logistical chasm, starkly illustrated by such small, everyday items, underscored the unsustainable nature of the German war economy and its inevitable collapse. It revealed that the war was not just being fought on battlefields, but in factories, in supply depots, and even in the kitchens that provision the armies, fundamentally altering how future conflicts would be planned and understood. The conventional wisdom of warfare often focuses on grand strategy, superior firepower, or the tactical brilliance of commanders. But the narrative of the German POWs and their first encounter with a donut reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth for the Axis powers. The true measure of a nation's warfighting capacity lay hidden not just in its battle plans, but in its logistical arteries and its economic heart. This wasn't merely a difference in battlefield performance. It was a profound structural divergence between two fundamentally opposed economic systems. And the donut was its most unexpected ambassador. Germany, a nation of engineers and meticulous planners, had achieved incredible feats of industrial output under duress. Under Albert Speer, armament production surged, particularly in 1944, yet its war economy was fundamentally extractive, built on the plundering of conquered territories and the brutal exploitation of forced labor. Factories, often dispersed and reliant on a fragmented European industrial base, were constantly under assault and starved of critical resources like oil and rubber. By late 1944, despite best efforts, the German war machine was consuming itself, unable to generate resources at the rate required to sustain a multi-front conflict against an increasingly robust enemy. Consider the stark reality of German supply. While their panzers were engineering marvels, their fuel tanks were often empty. Their soldiers, though disciplined, faced constant shortages of food, uniforms, and ammunition. The average German civilian, too, was enduring severe rationing, with daily caloric intake plummeting as the war dragged on. This was a war fought on a razor's edge of scarcity, where every resource was meticulously accounted for, and often simply not enough. This desperate scarcity was the backdrop against which the American donut made its appearance, a stark, almost absurd contrast. Across the Atlantic, the United States was unleashing an industrial leviathan unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its economy was designed for production, not plunder, leveraging vast domestic resources, a skilled workforce, and an unwavering commitment to mass manufacturing. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined, a strategic advantage that became insurmountable. This wasn't just about tanks and planes. It was about the sheer, overwhelming capacity to sustain a global conflict. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. produced an astonishing 86,000 tanks, 296,000 aircraft, and 64,500 landing craft. But crucially, it also produced billions of pounds of food and consumer goods, ensuring its soldiers were the best-fed, best-equipped fighting force in history. The donut, then, was not an isolated gesture of kindness. It was an edible microcosm of this colossal logistical machine, a tangible proof point of an economic engine running at full throttle. It represented the surplus, the efficiency, and the sheer productive power of the American system. When the German POWs tasted that sweet fried dough, they weren't just eating a pastry. They were consuming a direct, undeniable piece of evidence that inverted every premise their leaders had fed them. The decadent, materialistic West was not weak. It was astonishingly, frighteningly strong, capable of producing not just weapons of war, but also comforts for its own, and even its captured enemies on an unimaginable scale. This was the unexpected insight, the moment the premise inverted. The perceived weakness of American consumerism was in fact its greatest strength. The ability to generate such abundance, to bake and distribute millions of donuts to troops and even prisoners, wasn't a sign of softness. It was a testament to an unparalleled industrial and agricultural capacity, a logistical marvel that demonstrated a systemic resilience the German war machine simply could not match. It was a silent yet potent psychological weapon, chipping away at the carefully constructed edifice of Nazi ideology. Hold on to this detail for a moment, because it redefines everything that follows. The true battle, it turned out, was not just for territory, but for the very soul of the economic system that could sustain total war. The profound implications of this realization rippled far beyond the individual German prisoner savoring an alien, sweet treat. It wasn't just a moment of personal discovery. It was a systemic shockwave. The casual, almost effortless abundance of the American war effort, symbolized so perfectly by that ubiquitous donut, forced a complete reevaluation of military doctrine and national power. For decades, the measure of a formidable army had often been its fighting spirit, its tactical genius, or the sheer destructive power of its weapons. But World War II, particularly in the crucible of the Western Front, unveiled a truth far more encompassing. The ultimate sinews of war lay in the capacity to produce, to sustain, and to deliver on an unimaginable scale. Consider the strategic shift this implied. Before the war, German military planners, steeped in the Blitzkrieg philosophy, believed in swift, decisive campaigns that minimized the need for protracted logistical support. Their initial successes in Poland, France, and even the early phases of Barbarossa seemed to validate this approach. But these victories were achieved against nations with limited industrial bases or caught unprepared. When confronted with the combined industrial might of the Allied powers, particularly the United States, this strategy of rapid conquest and resource extraction proved fatally flawed. The German war machine, for all its terrifying efficiency, was a sprinter in a marathon, designed to consume rather than to generate. The American approach, by contrast, was a testament to the power of sustained industrial mobilization. From the massive Liberty ship program, which saw a new cargo vessel launched every few days, to the vast network of Red Ball Express convoys that kept Allied armies supplied across France, the U.S. demonstrated a logistical prowess that had no historical precedent. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps alone was responsible for supplying over 7 million American soldiers across the globe, a staggering feat of coordination involving millions of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The donut, therefore, wasn't just a morale booster. It was a tiny, delicious piece of this monumental supply chain, a tangible symbol of an economic engine that could not only equip armies, but also provide comforts that shattered enemy morale. The psychological impact on the German POWs was insidious and far-reaching. They saw not just the donuts, but the fully stocked commissaries, the clean uniforms, the regular mail service, and the generally robust health of their captors. This was a stark daily contrast to their own experience of dwindling rations, worn-out gear, and the constant threat of starvation. The Nazi propaganda machine had demonized the West as soft, weak, and decadent, yet here was undeniable proof of a material strength that dwarfed their own. It wasn't about a single battle lost. It was about the realization that the entire foundation of their belief system, their very understanding of power, was built on sand. How could a nation so decadent possess such overwhelming productive capacity? This question gnawed at them, eroding loyalty and fostering a deep sense of despair. This wasn't lost on Allied intelligence. Reports from prisoner interrogations consistently highlighted the shock and awe among German captives regarding American abundance. Many expressed disbelief at the sheer quantity and quality of food, clothing, and medical supplies available to U.S. soldiers, let alone to prisoners. These observations weren't just recorded. They became part of the strategic calculus. The Allies recognized that economic warfare wasn't just about bombing factories. It was also about demonstrating an insurmountable material superiority that broke the enemy's will to fight. The donut, in its unassuming way, became a psychological weapon, quietly undermining the German narrative of self-sufficiency and moral superiority. The lessons learned from this profound disparity profoundly shaped post-war military thought. The concept of total war evolved to encompass not just the battlefield, but the entire industrial and economic base of a nation. Logistical resilience, the ability to project and sustain power far from home, became as critical as tactical innovation. Military academies across the world, including the U.S. Army War College, began to integrate these lessons into their curriculum, emphasizing the interconnectedness of national economy, industrial output, and military effectiveness. The donut, in a sense, became a quiet, powerful symbol of this new understanding, that victory often belongs not to the fiercest warrior, but to the nation that can feed its soldiers, and even its prisoners, better than its adversary. The echoes of this lesson still resonate today, shaping how modern militaries approach everything from supply chain management to strategic alliances. But how did this seemingly simple lesson translate into long-term geopolitical shifts? And what does it truly reveal about the nature of conflict in our hyper-connected world? The lessons etched into the minds of those German prisoners, sparked by a simple donut, didn't vanish with the end of World War II. Instead, they became foundational pillars for an entirely new era of geopolitical competition. The logistical prowess demonstrated by the United States wasn't just a wartime anomaly. It was the blueprint for projecting global power in the decades that followed, fundamentally reshaping the very nature of international relations. The Cold War, for instance, wasn't merely a standoff of nuclear arsenals and ideological rhetoric. It was a grueling, decades-long contest of economic systems, of which logistical capacity was a silent yet decisive arbiter. Consider the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948. On the surface, it was an economic aid package designed to rebuild war-torn Europe. But beneath that humanitarian facade lay a profound strategic objective: to demonstrate the unparalleled productive capacity and generosity of the American system, contrasting it sharply with the Soviet model of scarcity and central control. The delivery of food, machinery, and resources across the Atlantic wasn't just about charity. It was a continuous, visible affirmation of the same abundance that had so shocked the German POWs. It showed that the decadent West could not only fight a global war, but also rebuild a continent, leveraging its economic engine as a tool of statecraft. Then came events like the Berlin Airlift in 1948 to 1949, a moment where logistics became the ultimate geopolitical weapon. When the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all land and water access, the conventional military response might have been to force a breakthrough. Instead, the United States and its allies mounted an aerial supply operation of unprecedented scale, flying in over 2.3 million tons of supplies, including food, coal, and medicine, in just under a year. Every 90 seconds, a C-54 Skymaster landed in West Berlin, a ceaseless parade of American and British cargo planes defying the blockade. This wasn't just about keeping a city alive. It was a direct, irrefutable demonstration of a logistical capability that the Soviets simply could not match, forcing them to back down without a single shot fired. The sheer organizational power, the ability to mobilize resources and sustain such an effort, spoke volumes about the underlying economic strength that had first delivered donuts to the front lines. This shift ingrained itself deeply into military planning. Post-war strategists, particularly in the Pentagon, understood that future conflicts wouldn't just be won by superior tanks or planes, but by the ability to move and sustain those forces far from home over extended periods. The creation of NATO in 1949, for example, was not solely a military alliance. It was a logistical framework designed to integrate supply chains and ensure the rapid deployment and sustainment of troops across a vast theater. The ghost of German logistical failure and the specter of American abundance haunted these strategic deliberations. The questions became, how do we ensure an uninterrupted flow of everything from fuel to medical supplies? How do we leverage our industrial base to maintain a qualitative and quantitative edge, not just in weaponry, but in the basic provisions that keep an army fed, clothed, and healthy? The donut, in its unassuming way, had taught a harsh lesson. Economic resilience and logistical reach were not secondary considerations in warfare. They were paramount. This realization extended beyond purely military matters, influencing foreign policy and international aid. The ability of the United States to produce, distribute, and sustain became a central pillar of its global influence, a form of soft power as potent as any aircraft carrier. It demonstrated a societal capacity that transcended mere military might, revealing a systemic advantage that continued to define global power dynamics well into the 21st century. But how does this historical insight, born from a simple pastry, speak to the complex, interconnected challenges of modern global conflicts and humanitarian crises, where supply chains are both more sophisticated and more vulnerable than ever before? This historical insight, born from a simple pastry, speaks directly to the complex, interconnected challenges of modern global conflicts and humanitarian crises, where supply chains are both more sophisticated and more vulnerable than ever before. The fundamental truth discovered on the battlefields and in the POW camps of World War II, that logistical resilience underpins national power, has only magnified in relevance. Today's globalized economy operates on principles of just-in-time delivery and intricate multinational networks, making them incredibly efficient but also exquisitely fragile. Consider the recent disruptions that have echoed the wartime challenges of supply. A single blockage in the Suez Canal, a cyber attack on a major shipping company, or a pandemic-induced factory shutdown can ripple across continents, creating shortages of everything from microchips to medical supplies. These aren't acts of war in the traditional sense, yet their impact on national security and economic stability can be profound, revealing the persistent vulnerability of even the most advanced systems. Just as German industry struggled to secure oil and rubber in 1944, modern nations grapple with securing rare earth minerals or critical components from distant shores, a constant, silent battle for the sinews of modern power. The parallel extends powerfully into the realm of humanitarian aid and disaster response. When a natural disaster strikes or a conflict displaces millions, the immediate challenge isn't just about good intentions, it's about the capacity to deliver. Which nations can swiftly mobilize vast quantities of food, water, medicine, and shelter? Which possess the logistical infrastructure, the airlift capability, the naval transport, the ground convoys, to reach populations in crisis zones, often under hostile conditions. The ability to project humanitarian abundance, to be the first responder with concrete, tangible relief, is a modern form of soft power directly descended from the Marshall Plan's strategic logic. It demonstrates not just generosity, but an underlying organizational and productive strength that resonates globally. Think of images from a major earthquake or a refugee crisis, the arrival of cargo planes laden with supplies, the distribution of food rations, the establishment of field hospitals. These aren't just acts of compassion. They are powerful, visible affirmations of a nation's capacity, mirroring the psychological impact of the donut on the German POWs. They showcase an ability to manage complexity, overcome obstacles, and sustain an effort far from home, a testament to an economic engine capable of generating and deploying surplus even in the face of immense global challenges. This visual narrative of capability can be as potent as any military display, shaping perceptions of leadership and reliability on the world stage. Conversely, the failure to deliver, the images of scarcity and chaos, can erode trust and undermine international standing. In the information age, where every logistical triumph or failure is broadcast globally, the perception of a nation's underlying strength is constantly being evaluated. The battle for hearts and minds is no longer fought solely with propaganda leaflets, but with the tangible proof of a functioning, robust supply chain. It's a continuous, low-intensity conflict where the ability to feed, clothe, and equip not just one's own, but also those in need becomes a critical measure of national vitality. The donut's quiet message of abundance has evolved into a global conversation about resilience, preparedness, and the hidden strengths that truly define a nation's influence. But what happens when this delicate balance is threatened by new forms of warfare? And how do nations adapt to maintain this critical edge in an increasingly volatile world? The question of maintaining that critical edge in an increasingly volatile world brings us to a new frontier of conflict, the unseen battles fought not on land or sea, but in the digital realm and across the very sinews of global commerce. If the donut symbolized the tangible strength of a nation's industrial and logistical might in the 20th century, then today, its modern equivalent is a resilient supply chain, impervious to disruption. New forms of warfare, often termed hybrid threats, specifically target this intricate web, aiming to cripple an adversary not through direct military engagement, but by severing the arteries of their economic and social stability. Cyber attacks, for instance, can paralyze critical infrastructure from ports and power grids to financial networks and healthcare systems. Imagine the profound impact if the sophisticated logistics software managing a nation's food distribution or medical supply chain were suddenly rendered inoperable. It wouldn't require a single bullet or bomb to induce widespread panic and shortages, achieving a strategic effect that once demanded massive military campaigns. This digital vulnerability underscores a modern truth: the capacity to produce and deliver, once a purely physical challenge, is now inextricably linked to cybersecurity and information dominance. Moreover, information warfare and disinformation campaigns can sow distrust in institutions, erode public confidence, and even disrupt the social cohesion necessary for a nation to respond effectively to crises. If a population loses faith in the government's ability to ensure basic provisions, or if false narratives undermine the very concept of shared sacrifice, the internal resilience of a state can fracture. This psychological dimension, once influenced by the stark contrast of a German POW's meager rations against an American donut, now plays out in the constant deluge of information, where perception can be as damaging as physical destruction. The ability to maintain internal order and public trust, even in the face of manufactured chaos, becomes a critical logistical component in itself, ensuring that the physical supply lines can continue to function without internal impedance. Nations are adapting to these evolving threats by recognizing that national security extends far beyond traditional military defenses. The focus has shifted towards building redundancy and resilience into critical supply chains. By guidance, help us to figure out better solutions. This means diversifying sources for essential goods, from semiconductors to pharmaceuticals, reducing reliance on single points of failure, whether they be a specific factory in a distant land or a vulnerable shipping lane. Policies like reshoring or friendshoring, bringing production back home or to trusted allies, are direct responses to the lessons learned from recent global disruptions and the escalating geopolitical tensions that threaten access to vital resources. Strategic stockpiling, a concept honed during the Cold War, has seen a resurgence. Governments are now investing heavily in reserves of medical equipment, rare earth minerals, and even food, acknowledging that global just-in-time systems, while efficient, carry inherent risks in times of crisis. For example, after the initial shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries initiated programs to ensure domestic production capacity for personal protective equipment and vaccines, understanding that relying solely on international markets could be catastrophic. This isn't just about economic policy. It's a fundamental reevaluation of what constitutes national self-sufficiency in an interconnected world. Furthermore, international cooperation and the strengthening of alliances have taken on new dimensions. NATO, for instance, isn't just coordinating military exercises, it's increasingly focused on collective resilience against cyber threats and the protection of critical infrastructure across. The shared understanding is that a vulnerability in one ally's supply chain can quickly become a vulnerability for the entire alliance. This collaborative approach recognizes that the donut effect, the psychological and strategic impact of undeniable material superiority, can only be maintained through a robust collective defense that spans not just tanks and planes, but also secure digital networks and diversified economic partnerships. The lessons of World War II, illuminated by the humble donut, continue to guide this complex evolution. They remind us that the visible war of combat is merely the tip of an iceberg, under which lies the vast, often invisible, struggle for resources, logistics, and the capacity to sustain. The ability to project power, whether military or humanitarian, fundamentally rests on the same bedrock: an economic engine capable of producing abundance and a logistical network resilient enough to deliver it, even in the face of sophisticated and evolving threats. The question is no longer just if a nation can fight, but how long it can sustain that fight and how it protects the very foundation of its capacity to do so. What does this deep historical understanding tell us about the future of global power, and how can we apply these timeless principles to navigate the challenges that lie ahead? The future of global power, it turns out, is still very much illuminated by the past, by the stark contrast observed in those muddy, freezing fields of 1944. The simple donut, a symbol of an industrial engine running at full tilt, revealed a truth far more profound than any tactical victory. It showed that the real strength of a nation, its capacity to endure and project influence, isn't solely in its visible military might, but in the invisible, intricate web of its economy and logistics, its ability to produce, distribute, and sustain. This fundamental insight, born from the shock of abundance amidst scarcity, remains the bedrock of national power, a principle as relevant today as it was in World War II. We live in an age where the battlefield has expanded beyond physical borders to encompass digital networks, supply chains, and even public perception. The cyber attacks that target infrastructure, the disinformation campaigns that erode trust, the geopolitical maneuvers that disrupt trade routes. These are the modern equivalents of the logistical choke points and resource shortages that plagued the Axis powers. just as the Wehrmacht's inability to feed its soldiers adequately was a symptom of a deeper systemic weakness. Today's vulnerabilities in global supply chains reveal the fragile underbelly of interconnected prosperity. The lesson from the donut is clear. Resilience in the face of these sophisticated, unseen threats requires not just military readiness, but an unyielding commitment to economic strength, technological security, and the social cohesion that allows a nation to adapt and overcome. It demands a constant reevaluation of what constitutes true self-sufficiency and strategic autonomy in a world where global dependencies are both a blessing and a potential curse. The seemingly minor details, the everyday items, often carry the weight of grand strategic truths. The donut, in its quiet sweetness, became a profound symbol of the systemic disparities that defined World War II and continue to shape the geopolitical landscape. It taught us that the war for hearts, minds, and ultimate victory is often won not just with steel and fire, but with the silent, relentless power of logistics and a society capable of generating and distributing abundance, even to its adversaries. This enduring principle, born from a moment of unexpected sweetness, continues to define the true sinews of global power and the challenges that lie ahead. If this deep dive into the hidden sinews of war made sense to you, subscribe now to WW2 Beyond Battles so you don't miss our next chapter. Leave a like so I know that exploring these unconventional angles of history is a path worth continuing. And tell me in the comments, what part of this journey truly turned the key for you? I'll be reading your insights and bringing those ideas into our future discussions.